So this talk is about getting rid of cron scripts using events. I'm Sheeri Cabral. I'm a database admin and architect for Mozilla. You can tweet or follow me on Twitter. You can look at my blog there. And the slides, you can download the slides from there later. So what are MySQL events? MySQL events are scheduled blocks of SQL code. You can schedule them to be recurring, like a cron script. And you can do it either at scheduled times, like every day at 4 p.m., or at intervals, every 5 minutes. Or you can schedule it to be happening at one time, which is like the Unix functionality of @. It's one of the benefits of MySQL events is that they are platform independent. So if you have your development on a Windows box and your testing and production on Unix, you can actually make an event instead of having to use cron or something like, or Windows Task Scheduler and mixing them. It's inside the database. It runs on all platforms and the same. So you don't have to worry about the fact that on Windows you're using Visual Basic and in Unix you're using a shell script. So your testing and everything will be the same because it's the same, it's inside the database. MySQL events were introduced in MySQL 5.1. So it's current. Right now we're on 5.5. So if you're using 5.1 and up, you can use events. Si tienes preguntas, levante su mano, and I will call on you right away. Well, maybe not right away, but I'll see and it's okay to ask questions. So why should you use MySQL events? Well, one good reason is to put the database functionality inside the database. Why would you want to do that? Well, it gets backed up with the database, which means it gets restored with the database. So here's an example of why you might use a MySQL event. Let's say you run a social website and you want to put on the home page, this is how many people are logged in right now. Because that you can chat with or you can say hello to or whatever, or that you can see their profile, they're online now. So you want to say, oh, we have 5,000 people online. Well, what you would first do is say, let me do a count star of this table every time the web page is hit. Well, once you become really popular, that's a bad idea. So you cache it. So what do? You make a cron script or a MySQL event to insert into a table that's cached a count star of the thing. You do the count star, you do that every 5 minutes, and then if somebody hits the home page, they'll see 5,000 people, and 5 minutes later, they'll only see 5,001 people. They won't see it right away, but it's good enough for, hey, look, there's approximately this many people online. It's good enough. So that's an example of what you might want to do with an event. You can also do anything you might do with a cron job that can work with SQL. It's backed up with the database. It's restored with the database. You don't have to remember when you build a new server, hey, is there a script that goes along with this or not? And you don't need to store authentication information. I mentioned this in my security talk earlier today. But if you have a cron script or a Windows Task Scheduler, you have to show it how to log into the database. So you have to give it information, which means it's stored on the hard drive. Which means if somebody breaks into it, they can get your password, right? That's not so good. So it's more secure than using a script on the shell or on the command line. So about the MySQL Event Scheduler, how does it work? There's a separate thread for the MySQL Event Scheduler. So if you're running events and you do show process list, you'll actually see a line for the event scheduler. Each event also has its own thread. So if you run one event every 5 minutes and one event every 10 minutes, they each have their own thread when they're running. So at minute 0, they'll both run, and you'll have 2 other threads in addition to that. At minute 5, only 1 thread. At minute 10, both threads again. And this is how events can be done in parallel. So if you have an event at minute 10 and minute 5, right, every 5 minutes and every 10 minutes, at minute 10, both can run at the same time. The server tries to run events as close to the time scheduled as possible, but just like cron, it's not always perfect. So if you say run it at 4 p.m., or you say run it at every 5 minutes, it's not exact, but it's close enough. But that's the same as cron, so it's nothing new. So don't say, oh, that's a drawback, because that's the same as the cron scheduler. This is what the event process looks like in show process list. I said I would show you. It's waiting for the next activation. I've never seen it in anything other than this, because when it activates, it's very quick. So, there's probably a real state that is, oh, I'm forking a new thread. I haven't seen it. So what are MySQL events? They're database objects. This means that they are they have to have a unique namespace within the database. If you have an event called export, let's say, you can have that event name in 2 different databases, but the same name. It's a database level object. You can give permissions on the database level. You can define an event or change it regardless of whether or not the scheduler itself is on. So if you need to change things, you can, which is good. You know, you wouldn't want to have to turn it on just to change something, and you don't have to turn it off to change something. So if it's turned off, you can change, you can make new events, but it's not going to run the events until you turn the event scheduler on. If you turn the event scheduler off while an event is running, that event will finish. So you're not saying stop right now everything you're doing, you're just saying no new events will start if you turn it off. It's a dynamic parameter. You don't need to restart the database to turn off the event scheduler. However, here's how you can do it. This is how you turn it on. By default, it's off. So here's how you turn it on. Set global event scheduler equals 1, or you can set it to on, just the text. You can also put it in the my.cnf file, so it will start up when you start the machine. You do need the super privilege to do this. Again, this is whenever you set any dynamic global parameter in a running MySQL, you have to have the super privilege. So this is nothing new, but you might not have realized it. So if you go to try to do this and you get an error, you might say, oh, I don't have the privileges. And you can check the process list, which I showed you before, to see if it's running. So how do you verify it? I always like to know, if I do something, how do I check it? Well, you can check it by doing show variables like event scheduler. You can also check to make sure by doing a show process list and seeing that event scheduler thread. Now, there is something that's not dynamic. If you want to disable the event scheduler, what is disabling the event scheduler? It's not on, it's not off. It means that nobody can turn it on, right? So by default, it's enabled, but it's off, and you can turn it on or off. But you can also disable the scheduler, and that is not dynamic. You have to restart MySQL to do that. So you might, for example, do that if you're taking a machine down for maintenance. You might want to say, I'm taking it for maintenance, don't run any events while I'm doing this maintenance. So you might disable it, but you have to restart MySQL to do that. And this is how you do it. You'd either start it from command line with that parameter as disabled, or you put it in the my.cnf as disabled. If it's disabled, like I said, you can't. What can you do? You can't turn it on. But what happens if you do try to turn it on? The error message you get is very clear. The MySQL server is running with the event schedulers disabled or skip grant tables, so it cannot execute the statement. So you don't have to worry too much. If you try to turn it on and it works, then it's fine. If you try to turn it on and it's disabled, you'll get this error. It's very clear. MySQL doesn't always have very clear error message, so we're very thankful for this. I could see, I heard laughs. That means you use MySQL. So, if you disable the event scheduler, the only change, so globally it's disabled, the only change is that the event scheduler will not run, and events won't run. You can still add events, take away events. So if you're doing maintenance and part of the maintenance is a code change and you're adding an event or deleting an event or renaming an event, you can still do that. Again, the new event won't run until not only the event scheduler is turned on, is enabled, but also turned on. So there's two things. It has to be enabled and it has to be turned on for the events to run. In practice, you don't turn it off or disable it all that much. So here's the least amount of words of syntax you can have in the create event. This is the minimal create event statement. The first thing to note is, in order to even run this, you need to make sure you have the event privilege. And it's a database and higher level privilege. So if you have the permissions of grant all on database name.star, you'll have that event, that privilege. But if you have grant insert, update, delete, and select on a database, on all the tables in a database, you won't have the event privilege. So you have to make sure you have the privileges to do it. So create event, and the event has to have a name. You have to tell what the schedule is, whether it's one time or recurring, and you have to do a statement. The statement can be more than one SQL statement, if you do that, you have to have a begin-end block. Now also if you do that, you have to change the delimiter. Because once you hit the semicolon, MySQL is going to try to parse what you do. And you haven't really finished your statement. So I'll change the delimiter to something like 2 pipes, something I would never use. Some people use 2 semicolons, you can do that too. And then you have to change it back too, don't forget. The code is SQL, but there's a modified SQL. It's not just statements you would use like select, insert, update, delete, set variables. You can use cursors. You can also do loops. So you can have while, until, for loops. You can do all that kind of stuff. And most people hear that MySQL has this stored procedure language or this events language, and it's not like PLSQL, and they say, oh, well then what can you do with it? But pretty much all you really need are iterators, right? All you really need are loops. I explained to someone, I said, well, you know, I'm not so sure it's good for you because it doesn't have like a robust programming language. And he said, well, what does it have? And I told him, I said, it's basically SQL with some loops and a case statement, things like that. He said, oh, that's all I need. All I need to do is go through some values and be done with it. So it may be what you need. So here's a sample event. We're putting it into the test database. So here's the simple test. Insert the time into a table. So here's the table we're going to use. It's very simple, right? Make a date time field with one table. So this is just setting up. We haven't done anything with the event yet. We're just making the table. And what the event is going to do is going to insert the time into a table. And here's how we do that. So create event, event name, on schedule every 5 seconds. So it's going every 5 seconds. It's recurring. Do insert into my log, that table. My time is the column. Select now. That's what it's going to do. And I put a semicolon at the end. Because there's only one statement, I didn't need to change the delimiter. So what happens if there's already an event with the same name? You'll get an error. You can use create event if not exists if you forgot whether or not you already made it. You can also use drop event if exists. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll be in MySQL Workbench, or I'll have a text field open, and I'll put the event I'm making in there, and the top says delimiter pipe, drop event if exists, event name, run the, then the code, and then I'll have delimiter semicolon. So all I have to do is copy and paste the whole thing and put it into my MySQL command line tool. Or if I'm using Workbench, I just hit run and it goes. Otherwise, it's very hard to kind of edit long events if you're trying to debug it in the command line. It's easier to use MySQL Workbench or some other kind of development tool. MySQL Workbench, by the way, is free, and it's provided by Oracle. So you can use it and does neat things like reverse engineering an SQL schema into an entity relationship diagram, an ER diagram. So you can see the tables visually just from having scripts, just from getting a MySQL dump of the schema. What about starting and ending times? Well, by default, the event starts now and it ends never. It goes until forever. That's the default. You can actually change that, right? So we said every 5 seconds, insert the time to this table. Great. And it starts whenever the event goes, is accepted, and then it ends never. So it's going to go forever. So you can actually set the period that it starts and ends in by using the starts or ends clauses in create event statement. And it's part of the schedule. So there's a clause on schedule, and that contains not just whether it's recurring or a one-time, it also has the start and end. So you can say it's relative, it ends now plus interval 1 year, or you can have absolute, which is the exact time you want it to start or end. So you can do either one of those. You can use relative or absolute, and you can mix them. You can say starts 2012 0705 0000 plus 1 day if you really want. Yes, and you can say starts without ends and ends without starts. I think that's what the next slide is. Nope, that's a future slide. So here's a sample event with a start time, and you can, actually it's a sample event with an end time. Drop event if exists event scheduler test, right? So I said that's what I did. And then create event on schedule every 1 second instead of every 5 seconds because I was testing it and I got impatient. Ends now plus interval 1 second. So this starts as soon as the statement gets accepted, and it ends in 10 seconds. That way, I didn't like have the log fill up while I was doing my tests, because, well, that happened to me. I was testing it out, and it went for like 3 days, and I was like, why is there so much room in this? Why is the file taking up so much space? And then I realized. So, by default, an event period starts immediately and never ends. So if you set the start time but not the end time, the event period starts at the start time and it never ends. If you set the end time but not the start time, the event period starts immediately and ends at the end time. It's pretty easy. So, how do you see events that are already there? You can use show events in MySQL. It's like the show tables command. You have to be in a database, or you say show events from database name. You can also say show events like and use like. It's just like show tables. There's a table in the information schema called events, and it's also stored in the MySQL event table, which you shouldn't change. But if you really want to know how does it get backed up with MySQL, that's the table it gets backed up in. So the question is, can I use the same event for all the databases you have? The answer is yes and no. The event is stored as an object in one database, but it's just SQL. So you could use named. You can name the databases if you want. If you're saying you have 3 of the same database and you want that event to run in each database, yeah, you would have to create it 3 times. But if you want to do cross-database queries, you can do that in the SQL. So, but I think you were asking, can I run the same one in each of 3 databases? Then you would have to define it in each of the databases. Yes. No. The question is, if you have an event, can you run the event on a database in another server? The answer is no, sort of. I mean, usually no. If you're using a federated table and the federated table is on another server, then yes, because you can access it, but not really. You would have to, again, copy it to the other server. But one thing to note, and we'll get to this in a later slide, but I'll say it now. If you have a master and you define the event on the master, it will replicate to the slave. There are ways to avoid having duplicate information, because any changes in SQL you do, any DML, any inserts, updates, deletes, those get replicated too. So there's actually a parameter that you can set that says, disable this on the slave. So the event will run on the master but not on the slave. So yeah, you can really, if you want, you can look at the event table, but don't change it. And I would say don't look at it. You have the nice format of information schema events and show events. So there's kind of no need to look at that table. But it is there. So how do you see what an event looks like? We have show create event, just like show create table. So you have the event name, the SQL mode, which is the SQL mode that's set when you make the event. The time zone is system, which is, again, the time zone when you made the event. Why is the time zone important?
Because the time you will run depends on that.
Exactly. The time that you're going to run it depends on the time zone. If your client is in a time zone 3 hours ahead and it starts to do it, then you might have to wait 3 hours for the first run to happen. So create event, here's the create statement. So if you ever go back to something and realize, oh, I need to change this event to add something, you would probably do this, copy and paste the show create event, and then change it and put it in. So you have the create event statement, you have the character set, the collation, and the collations. So what happens after the period ends? Let's say you say it's going to end in a year from now. What happens there? By default, and I don't think this is a good idea, by default MySQL drops the event. So you might say, well, let me run this event, and maybe you're running in testing mode, so you want to do it for a day. And then you come back the next day and you go, where's my event? Oops, it dropped it. So the default is to drop the event, and there's this clause called on completion. And so the default is on completion, not preserve. So how do you change it? You use the on completion clause, and you say on completion, preserve. And I'll show you the syntax for everything. So don't worry about not doing it. So here's a one-time event. So the question is on completion after the next time it runs, or is it after the schedule? It's after the schedule. So if you don't set the ends it will never be dropped because it will never finish. And there's no problem. If there's an error, it will still try to run every whatever. But we've been talking now about recurring ones, every 5 minutes or at 4 p.m. every day. What about a one-time event, like an at job? That, the on schedule, instead of saying on schedule every, you say on schedule at. And again, you can use relative or absolute values. So here, we say, okay, let's do the insert into the table once in 5 seconds. Now again, this is a very silly example, but you can put any kind of SQL in there. You can run a store procedure. You can do a lot of stuff. There is a list of things that aren't allowed, and I'll show you that at the end, I think. So that doesn't really matter. That's just a placeholder for what you really want to do. So that's how you do a one-time event. Now, how do you preserve a one-time event? Because this is very important, right? The one-time event starts, when it starts, and ends when it's right after it starts. It only runs once. So make sure with your at events, if you do want to preserve them, I say it's exactly like cron or at, except cron or at, the at job is preserved once it's done, right? So on completion, preserve. That's where you would put it. You put it on this after the schedule clause. So it's starting to get more complex. We're building up more and more things you can put into it. So I said here's something that says show events, right? I said you could say show events. What does it show you? It doesn't show you the create statement, but it does show you some interesting information. So it shows you things like the name, okay, the database you're in, okay, type one time or recurring, right? The show create event statement didn't show you that information. You can guess it from what the create statement that says every or at. But this tells you exactly. So you can actually query the MySQL events table because it has this, or the information schema.events table has this information. So if you want to get all of the names of the events and what databases they're in that are one time, you can do that by querying the information schema events table. So this one is executing at. Now you'll notice the next 4 values are null. Interval value, interval field, starts and ends are all null. If you used a recurring value where you said on schedule every, the execute at would be null, and the other 4 fields would have values. Execute at every 5 would be the value, second would be the field, starts at whatever time it starts and ends at, and if it's null, starts or ends, it means that you didn't put a value in. So ends null is if it never ends. The status is enabled, which means that event is enabled. The other 2 values you can have, who can guess the one of the values? If you have enabled, what else do you have? Disabled, right. So you can actually, if you want to disable one event, you don't have to drop it. You can set it to disabled. The third option is called slave side disabled, which I explained before, is if you're running it on a master and slave, by default, the slave will be slave side disabled. Notice how you have the definer there and the originator. That helps you set permissions. So I defined this as the root user. You probably don't want to do that. Maybe you want to define it as the DBA user because it's a DBA specific command, or maybe you want to run it as a temporary user. Some user that has more permissions than a real user would, because you're just using those permissions to run that event. Not that it really matters though, because it's internal in the system, right? So it's not like someone's going to run the event. How can we know? So the question is, how do we know if an event is run successfully? I will talk about that in a minute. I don't know exactly where it's coming up, but we're going to talk a little bit more about alter event right now.
So a question about the definer. What you're saying is that basically that event is going to run using that particular account?
Correct. So the question is, the definer is the invoker. Is that how it runs? And the answer is yes.
Okay, so for example, in this case that you have root, that means that actually you were logged as root whenever you create that event, right?
Correct. So it means that whoever you're logged in as, that's how it is. And the same character set and client collation and time zone. That's what you were in when you made the event, right? I probably should have been in UTF-8 when I made the event. But what can you do? You can change things. So you can do an alter event. Alter event it's just like alter table, right? If you create a table and you want to add a column, you can do alter table, add column. Very similar with events. You could say alter event, on completion preserve. Let's say you forgot to say that. You can say alter event, event name, on completion preserve, and that will change it. You do have to be careful about the clauses, right? On schedule is one clause. So let's say you want to change the interval of something. Instead of every 1 second, you want to do it every 1 minute. This middle of the thing is incorrect. You can't just say ends now, because that's not the clause. You have to do the whole clause. The whole clause is on schedule, or you change the end time. On schedule every 1 second. So that is one thing that has bitten me before. You'll get an obvious error, but you're kind of like, what did I do wrong? I'm changing the when it ends. It's part of the on schedule clause. How do you rename an event? The only difference between alter table or the table changing and the events is that there is a rename table, but there's no rename event. If you want to rename the event, you can say alter event, event name, rename, new event name. And that's the only difference of the alter syntax between create event and alter event. So if you want, any clause that you can put in the create event, you can put in the alter event. So here's the full create syntax. I said we would get to this. So you can actually change, if you're the root user, you can change who the definer is. So you can actually change that if you want. So I did say before, I knew I was going to change this, but I did say before it's whoever you are when you make it. But if you are the root user, you can say, I want the definer to be Sheeri at localhost, not root at localhost.
But if you're not root, you cannot set it as root.
Correct. If you're not root, you cannot set it as anybody else. You have to be, well, I won't say root. I'll say if you don't have the super privilege, you can't set it as somebody else. Because the root user is not special in MySQL. It's not like in Unix where root is special. It has the UID of 1 or 0, I forget. It's very special. In MySQL, it doesn't matter. Anyone can have the super privilege. You can delete the root user. It's fine. So create, definer equals whatever. Event, if not exists, you can say. The event name on schedule, here's the schedule. On completion, you can say preserve or not preserve. You can enable, disable, or disable on slave. So if you want to set it right away to enable, disable, or disable on slave, you can put a comment if you want, and you can say do SQL statement. And every one of these clauses can be changed with alter. So if you wanted to change the comment, you can say alter event, event name, comment, comment. So that's the full syntax for create, and that's almost the full syntax for alter. The only difference is you can have rename and alter. So what does the schedule look like? This is what the schedule looks like. You can either say at or every. And at can be relative, so you have the intervals, or absolute. The timestamp can be relative or absolute, right? So you can say every, and you can also say starts or ends. You can only say starts or ends for every, because at, you're giving it a start and an end. And the interval is not just minute and second, but you can do year and quarter, and year, month, and day, hour. It's very specific. These are, the interval is a data type that you can use in a lot of things in MySQL. For example, time, addition, and subtraction. So the question is, in the case that it's week or month, can you specify the day? You specify the day, with the timestamp. So you don't say every Monday for a week. You say, you would say every 1 week starts today, or starts, what? And the date that has Monday, exactly. I was going to figure out if today's the 10th or 11th. Today's the 11th, Monday was the 9th. So you would have to say starts the 16th, because that would be next Monday. And for month, you can't do like the second Wednesday of every month. You can only do starts on the 10th and does every month. That's just how it works. But you could do every 4 week, right? If you wanted the second Wednesday, you would say every 4 week. Although sometimes, is it 5 sometimes? Yeah, so I don't think you could do every second Wednesday or something like that. So, you asked before, how do you know the event ran successfully? This is what it looks like in the error log. You get notes in the error log. So, if you are doing any tracking of your error log and you say, page me if there's something new, you're going to get paged a lot if you have an event, right? You only want a page if you have an error or maybe a warning, right? These are just notes. So this works with syslog and all those kinds of things where you get notes. So that's what it does. So note that you say the event scheduler, you had the user is root at localhost, that was the definer. The test, event scheduler test started in a thread. And then you could see executed successfully. And then it started in the next thread, in the next second, and then executed successfully. But that was the last execution, so I'm dropping the event. So you might want to ignore the notes, except if it says dropping. You might want to know about that, because in case you forgot. So what about errors? What happens if you have an error? If you have an error, let's say we're going to create an event that's going to have an error. We're going to insert something into a table that doesn't exist. MySQL lets the event go fine because the syntax is correct. It doesn't check to make sure that the table exists. It doesn't do any of that kind of checking. It does check to make sure that the user exists if you changed it to a different user. But here's what would happen. When it ran, instead of saying ran successfully, it would say table doesn't exist. Now, this is very obvious in this case what the error is, because I made it very simple. But you don't get any line numbers on where the error was. It's just like stored procedures. There's not very good debugging for problems with errors. And then you can see it dropped the bad event because I said unschedule at now, so it only ran it once. So then it dropped the event, which is fine by me because I knew it was bad. So yeah, like stored procedures, stored functions, and triggers, event errors are not always easy to debug. Don't ignore error in the event scheduler, but you can ignore note, except for maybe dropping. What about the runtime behavior? When I say runtime behavior, I mean character set, collation, SQL mode. So who here has ever used an SQL mode? Nobody. So what an SQL mode is, it changes the behavior, hence runtime behavior. It changes the behavior of how MySQL works. For example, who here knows how you escape a table name in MySQL? It's also how it shows up in MySQL dump. Use it quotes. What kind of quotes? Single. It actually uses a backtick by default. The thing right next to the one, yeah. It's on like that on your keyboards too. So it uses a backtick. But you can set the SQL mode to be different. You could set it to be ANSI quotes, and it will quote it with the right way. And then by default, ANSI quotes, single quote and double quote is different. I think single quotes are for escaping and double quotes are for strings. It could be the other way around. I think that's how it is. So if you set the SQL mode to ANSI quotes, and you try to say a string and you quote it with single quotes, you're going to get an error because it's tried to escape it, not be a string. So you can actually, and there's a whole lot of different ones. There's like an Oracle SQL mode. There's there's all these different kinds of SQL modes that change the behavior of how things work. For example, there's one that doesn't allow. You may have heard strict mode. So in strict mode, it's actually either strict transactional tables or strict all tables. If you get a warning, it actually will make it an error. So if you try to insert a value that's higher than the allowed value, MySQL usually gives you a warning. If you're using one of those two strict SQL modes, it actually gives you an error and doesn't do that. So there's a lot of ways to change the behavior. At any rate, the SQL mode is not one of the clauses in the create statement. So if you want to change it and alter it, what you have to do is you have to set it before you make the event. So let's say you've already made the event and you want to change it. How do you change it? You drop the event, change your SQL mode, and make it again. It's kind of a pain, but that's the way it is. And character set and collation are the same way. You drop the event, you change your character set, you change your collation, you create the event again. It's kind of annoying, but what can you do? So, how do you change who the event is invoked as? We already talked about this. The definer is the invoker for the event. So if you wanted to have different permissions than the person that created it, the default is the current user. You can change it, and again, only if you have the super privilege. Now, if the user does not exist at create time or alter time, you will get a warning, not an error. Okay? You will get an error when the event is run because it says, I can't run this as this user doesn't exist. If you define it as a user, Sheeri at localhost, and then that user gets dropped later, when you drop the user, MySQL says, okay, user dropped. It doesn't say user dropped, but by the way, there's this event that doesn't work now. You'll have to check your error log. So again, check your error logs. I said that I would show you at the end what the limitations are for events. This is a list of SQL. So in the do clause and begin and end, you can use anything except you can't use alt or view. You can't use lock or unlock tables. You can't load data from a file. You can use the insert delayed statement, but it doesn't actually do any of the delay. It just treats it as a regular insert statement. So technically you can use it, but it's a limitation. And I think that's anything. Does anybody have any questions? This is kind of a shorter one because I know it's towards the end of the day and we're all tired. What happens if you so the question is, what happens if you make a call to a stored procedure inside the event, but the stored procedure has some of those limitations ones? First of all, I think that stored procedures may have the same limitations. But the real answer is, MySQL doesn't check that far. It only checks to make sure the event syntax is true. But I'm pretty sure that the limitations are the same in procedures. So I think that really, really it answered both questions. The question is, can you use events for backup tasks and things like that? Only for the kinds of backup tasks you can do in SQL. You can't really do a physical file backup because you can't do that. But if you wanted to do a select into out file, you can. Great. Thank you.